Let us pray. Lord in heaven, we thank you for the blessed hours and the Sabbath, and we thank you for this big Sabbath and the presentations that have already been given. And in this closing study, we ask for your blessing, the presence of your Spirit, to bring clarity to the things that are being shared and to bring them home to each heart. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, happy Sabbath again. So the subject I will be talking about is, the study is entitled Liberal versus Radical Feminist Lens, or the Radical Feminist Lens. Right. So Mtetwa has been highlighting the issue of the lens or worldview that we hold to as something that is a salvational issue, and how we've moved from a right-wing worldview. We've moved away from the conservative stream into the liberal stream. But within the liberal stream, not all there is correct. We need to scrutinize the liberal stream. We need to be able to sift the liberal stream to identify what within it is correct and what isn't. All right, so that's what we'll be doing. I'll be discussing the liberal lens or the liberal worldview and the radical feminist worldview, comparing and contrasting them, more so contrasting them. So we have a clearer perspective, I hope, about how we should understand the things that are going on in the world, and what issues we should be emphasizing versus what issues mainstream media or even the far left are emphasizing. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so just to reiterate some of the points I've already made, our worldview is like a lens that we look through, right? It guides how we interpret the world around us. Now, the Midnight Cry, what the Midnight Cry led us to do was that it led us to switch from a conservative worldview to a liberal one, right? That's straightforward, I think, for everyone here at this point. And switching to that liberal stream, that led us to the step of espousing feminism, specifically radical feminism, as being the philosophy or approach that we espouse. But it's not enough to be a liberal, as is being emphasized in the latest studies coming out of Australia by Mtetwa. Within liberalism, there are perspectives or ways of viewing issues and the world which are not correct. And many in the movement have seen light in perspectives that are prominent, not only to liberalism, but specifically to the far left, what has been referred to as the Bernie Sanders camp, or even the squad. Their names are escaping me. I know their names, but now when I need to remember them for presentation, they escape me in the moment. The squad, the Bernie Sanders camp, the far left, they are, because as we made the shift from conservatism to liberalism, they are some of the most prominent voices on the left, maybe you could put it that way. And we had not learned, or many people did not learn, how to sift the left wing for what is correct that they hold to and what isn't. So that is the work that is taking place now, because many of the things that camp holds to are not correct. So when we look at the left, how would we characterize the left? What are the characteristics of the left as a, let's say, as a political movement, as an ideology? And it's probably useful to view it in contrast to the right, right? What are the characteristics of the left? So I have a table here that I'll share for time. Which just highlights a few points. If I can find it. There it is. Okay, so when you look at the left in contrast to the right, we would say that being left is characterized by identifying as being progressive, and one could have discussion as to what that means. But you understand what it means when we contrast it with the right, who tend to espouse traditional morality, right? They conserve the cultural ideas of past generations, the traditional morality, whereas the left are progressive. They are changing their views and their morality in response to the development of culture, in response to new information, right? They are progressing, right? So the left is progressive, the right espouses traditional morality. The left is, in the United States, is associated with the Democratic Party, whereas the right in the United States is associated with the Republican Party. The left is associated with socialism, which is the political philosophy that encourages it's a distributive political philosophy, right? That encourages the distribution of resources to everybody, that people may be benefited, whereas the right espouses more a philosophy of self-reliance and individualism. The left is egalitarian, or supports egalitarianism, which is viewing people as equals, right? Egalitarian, everyone is on the same level, whereas the right is again associated with their traditional morality, tends to be patriarchal in its approach, patriarchal in its thinking. The left supports globalism, whereas the right is more nationalistic. The left supports big government in order to implement the equality that they espouse, that they believe in, whereas the right believes in small government to give space for people to have the freedom that they emphasize, right? So the left emphasizes equality over freedom. The right emphasizes freedom over equality, right? So I don't think any of that, which has been covered in terms of what characterizes the left, would be new to any of us. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But in addition to all of that, the left is also characterized by anti-imperialism, and that's where we're going to spend some time. The left is characterized by an anti-imperialist worldview. What is anti-imperialism? Let's unpack that as we continue on. What is anti-imperialism? So I have a quote here that I will share. And it says, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism denote opposition to empire, right? They're anti-empire. Whereas the latter, right, the latter anti-colonialism, whereas the latter has been mostly understood as opposition to formal colonial rule in a narrow sense. The former, anti-imperialism, has come to be defined ever more expansively. Particularly in the 20th century, anti-imperialists resisted formal and informal means of control by stronger over weaker nations. So anti-imperialism is opposition to stronger nations controlling weaker nations. Such resistance to empire emerged both in the colonies themselves and in the ruling metropolises. But a sustained transnational anti-imperialist movement never emerged because both metropolitan and colonial anti-imperialists pursued separate agendas in their own respective communities. Right, so the left is characterized by, they have an anti-imperialist emphasis, an anti-imperialist lens through which they view the world. And if that sounds strange, it'll become more apparent what we mean, what we're talking about. So this anti-imperialism, as we've defined it, opposition to empire, opposition to colonialism, opposition to stronger nations controlling weaker nations, opposition to the things that have followed from colonialism, race-based oppression, and so on. That's been helpful. Anti-imperialism has been positive in that it has brought the oppression that colonialism engenders. It has brought this oppression, the issue of race, and how more powerful nations abuse weaker nations. It has helped to bring all these issues to the forefront. And these are important issues, and they're important issues, at least as we understand the prophetic message. They are important issues. And this was needed at the time that anti-imperialism began to emerge as a political philosophy, because this is the post-World War II period. The post-World War II period when former colonies were going through their battles for independence across Africa, Asia, South America. Former colonies were going through their battles for independence. And these topics, the racial oppression that came with imperialism, the stronger nations oppressing the weaker nations, these issues had been neglected to a large extent in scholarship and within popular and political discourse. And they'd been neglected by the left. So this lens, this anti-imperialist lens, which centers issues of race in both national and international contexts, and the disparate power relationships between first and third world countries, this is the lens through which much of the left views the world today, right? And what happens is that in a world full of oppression, the world is full of oppression, this anti-imperialist lens, this anti-colonialism has tended to dictate which forms of oppression are highlighted and which actors are given the most scrutiny as bad actors or good actors, right? It is dictated how issues are ranked in importance in terms of the different forms of oppression, the different types of problems that exist in the world. So again, it has been useful in how it has highlighted certain issues, but a negative development with this anti-colonialist anti-colonialist lens, a negative development with it is that it is narrow. It is narrow and one-dimensional. What does that mean? It understands imperialism and the wrongs that followed from imperialism to be the root cause of the deepest problems in the modern world. Right? And not only that, it not only understands colonialism, and from colonialism you connect slavery, and you can connect racism as a global issue being perpetuated by the West, right? That perspective. It understands colonialism as the cause of the deepest problems in the modern world, and it understands it as being an exclusively Western phenomenon, right? So this becomes important, right? Particularly when we start saying we are radical feminists. Does this guiding assumption of the left's anti-imperialist worldview, does it line up with what we are saying as radical feminists? Radical feminism having been identified prophetically. So that becomes an important question that we'll come back to. We'll come back to that. So other forms of oppression, such as theocracy or patriarchy or authoritarianism, these are relegated to secondary issues. The main problem is Western nations and what they've done in oppressing other countries, in engaging in colonialism, and all the real, yes, horrors and atrocities that have followed from colonialism. But that is their emphasis. Now, there's an article that was shared to the media broadcast, and it highlights this problem with the left, their narrow anti-imperialist lens, right? But it does so within the context of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So the article we're going to quote, we're going to read a long quote, but it's necessary. It's called "Singling Out Israel, a Perspective from the Left." Right, so this was shared in the media broadcast. I will just share the portion we're going to read on the screen. There we go. So this is the last section of the article. It's called "The Left, the West, and One-Dimensional Anti-Imperialism." And I'll start by reading the last few sentences of the previous paragraph, starting from "In contrast." Right? So it says, on the left today, Zionism is generally seen as a necessarily malign force, an almost metaphysical evil that has brought ruin to the Middle East. How did such a shift in left-wing thinking occur? Why is it that Israel is viewed with such disproportionate hostility on the left? And that's something that I can attest to, maybe something that you've observed as well, which is that the Israel-Palestine conflict and the oppression of Palestinians is an issue of major focus for people on the left. And that focus is disproportionate to the attention given to other real crimes, atrocities, oppressions that are taking place in the world today. So this article is explaining why, and it goes on to say, as was noted above, the answer lies in Western imperialism and white settler colonialism. But a question remains, why is it that these related phenomena are so central to left-wing politics today? They are, of course, examples of oppression, and so any democratic movement worthy of the name should resist them. But why do they often take precedence over other forms of subjugation, such as authoritarianism, theocracy, or patriarchy, to name a few, that are frequently overlooked or downplayed by the anti-imperialist left? The answer lies in third worldism and the versions of it that have become prominent in progressive circles. Third worldism is the political philosophy that began to emerge after the Cold War. And it basically said that the North-South divide, the divide between rich countries, predominantly Europe and the United States, versus the global South, which is poorer countries in Africa, South America, and Asia that were most of them were former colonies, that the North-South divide was of primary importance. It was more important than the East-West divide between the United States and Russia in the context of the Cold War. So that's what third worldism is, and people on the left began to espouse this third worldism in tandem with their anti-colonialist worldview. So it says, the post-war period produced a profound transformation within the intellectual culture of the Western left. The anti-colonial struggles in what became known as the Third World shook many progressives in the US and Europe out of their parochial mindsets. A new politics of anti-imperialism forged by the conflicts in Suez, Vietnam, and Algeria, among others, blended with orthodox Marxism and became a staple of left-wing theory and practice. Thinkers and activists such as Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, and Che Guevara, whose ideas were crafted in the heat of bitter anti-colonial struggles, became essential reading for members of the New Left and have helped to shape progressive thinking about relations between North and South, West and East. These influences have led to a lot of productive work. European and American activists, for example, have grown increasingly conscious of issues relating to empire, colonialism, and race, topics the Western left had historically neglected. As important as these changes have been, however, a counterproductive tendency has also gained traction, one that can be characterized as one-dimensional anti-imperialism. This is a selective and deeply essentialist perspective that in a curious fashion, that in a curious inversion of Eurocentrism, understands imperialism to be an exclusively Western phenomenon that emanates inexorably from Western capitals. So what is this saying? It's saying that what this focus by the left on anti-imperialism and third worldism has brought certain issues to has allowed them to highlight certain issues, but it has also produced a counterproductive trend in that it is one-dimensional, it is narrow, it is anti-imperialism above anything else. And it's actually an inversion of Eurocentrism. What is Eurocentrism? Eurocentrism is I'm reading a definition. It's an attitude, a conceptual apparatus or set of beliefs that frame Europe as the primary engine and architect of world history, the bearer of universal values and reason, and the pinnacle and therefore model of progress and development, right? There's still a lot of Eurocentrism today. The idea that Europe is the source, the engine, the driver of human progress. They're the architects of world history, and they are the model of progress for the rest of the world. Right. And of course, a discussion can be had about why that is problematic. But Eurocentrism views Europe as the source, right, of all these good things. The anti-imperialist perspective of the left views, in a curious inversion of Eurocentrism, it understands imperialism to be the source of the world's problems, right? Not the source of the good things in human progress in the world, but the source of the world's problems. And that imperialism emanates from, it's a Western phenomenon that emanates from the countries and capitals of Europe and North America, United States more specific. Okay. So it goes on to say, in a curious inversion of Eurocentrism, it understands imperialism to be an exclusively Western phenomenon that emanates inexorably from Western capitals. What's more, it sees imperialism as the sole source of the world's ills and demotes other forms of oppression to a secondary position or ignores them entirely. Conversely, it is a viewpoint that tends to accord victims of Western aggression a privileged position within an unwritten hierarchy of victimhood, a hierarchy that determines some people to be worthier of solidarity than others. So if you have a worldview that highlights the crimes of colonialism perpetrated by Western nations, then it follows then that victims of that colonialism would be awarded a higher ranking, shall we say, of those on a hierarchy of those deserving of sympathy, an unwritten hierarchy of victimhood, it says. Then goes on to say that it is against this backdrop that the left's over-attunement to Israel must be understood. The Jewish state, as we have seen, is the product of a white settler colonialism that took root under Western European imperialism. This effectively is a situation that has continued with the occupation of the West Bank and the strangulation of Gaza, and the creation of settlements with the support of the United States. The creation of Israel also led to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and the post-1948 period has seen repeated attempts by Israeli governments at politicide or the complete destruction of the Palestinians as a political community. These are the undeniable realities of the very one-sided Israel-Palestine conflict. But then it goes on to say, but these are also unexceptional realities. The 20th century was a brutal century of genocide, ethnic cleansing, violent attempts to forge nation states out of diverse communities, rapid industrialization, and the persecution of minorities. The first couple of decades of the 21st century have hardly been much better. Again, this background, the Israeli-Palestine conflict has been, against this background, the Israeli-Palestine conflict has been a relatively mild affair. But when seen through the distorting prism of one-dimensional anti-imperialism, it morphs into something more. Israel becomes the representative of Western imperialism and the most malign of all evils, and the Palestinians gain the questionable privilege of becoming the victims most worthy of support. Right. So for our purposes, that's all we will read. The anti-imperialist aspect of the left's worldview has distorted the Israel-Palestine conflict and how it should be viewed. Right? There are all manner of atrocities taking place across the world. Right? But some of them do not have this element of originating or being supported or having the West involved as a problematic actor in them. So those other atrocities do not garner as much attention on the left as does the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, so I have established that point. We're looking at the left, and we're looking at the worldview that the left espouses, and which is, by extension, the worldview that many in the movement espouse, because we've not learned how to sift the left. So some of these perspectives we've accepted almost wholesale, uncritically, from whether it's the Squad, whether it's Bernie Sanders, whether it's social commentators like Trevor Noah, right? We listen to them and we agree with them and receive what they say uncritically. But not only are they guilty of purveying sexism themselves, particularly, I'm saying like in Trevor Noah, not only, he's guilty of reducing sexism to a culturally relative issue in certain instances, in a very problematic way. But we don't see that. People just listen to him and hang on to what he says, as is done with other actors on the left and the far left, right? But how should we view these things? What is the lens through which we should be viewing issues in the world, right? And we ought to view the world, we ought to view what is taking place through the lens, wearing the eyeglasses that God has given us. And the eyeglasses that God has given us, which tint everything, right? That's a radical feminist lens, a radical feminist perspective. So the left has emphasizes the issue of race, and related to that, the crimes of the West, particularly as they relate to colonialism and the oppressions that have followed from colonialism, and the relations within society, race relations within society, the disparate power dynamic, and the power relations between Western nations and states from the global South on a global level. So that's the left's worldview, or we say the far left, more specifically. And it says that colonialism, Western-based racism and colonialism are the biggest problems, or the root of the biggest problems in society today. But when you put on a radical feminist lens, radical feminism recognizes that the oldest, deepest, worst, and most pervasive form of oppression today is gender-based oppression. and therefore gender should be the central focus, right? And what does this do? Centering gender-based oppression leads to a very different analysis of issues. For example, with the Israel-Palestine conflict, the left rightly views Palestinians as victims of Israeli crimes and oppression, okay? A two-state solution is proposed, which is the best possible arrangement given the terrible circumstances history has placed those two people in. The two-state solution is the best outcome that can write. Both peoples are really between a rock and a hard place, and a two-state solution is the best thing that can is the best way forward for both the parties, for both peoples. But no emphasis in the left's analysis is made on the plight of Palestinian women. There is a big problem in Palestine with sexism, with gender-based violence and gender-based oppression. I got some statistics from the United Nations. Over 50% of women in Palestine and the Gaza Strip suffer from some form of gender-based violence. Right? I'll just read this here. It's from the UN. It says, gender-based violence, or GBV, is a key protection concern in Palestine. According to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, 2011 violence survey, an average of 37% of women are victims of gender-based violence in Palestine. In the Gaza Strip, this percentage increases to 51%. Women in Palestine face multiple layers of violence and discrimination. The analysis made in the UN Special Rapporteur's report on violence against women in 2005 found two main reasons for the gender-based violence level in Palestine. The first one, traditional patriarchal norms and values. And the second one, the Israeli occupation and its consequences. Yes, so the Israeli occupation and its consequences has made things worse, but the first issue, the first cause is the traditional patriarchal norms and values of the culture of the people in Palestine. That is the root source of, I don't think you can imagine. And by the way, this is what is reported, right? The report acknowledges that there's a lot of underreporting because there's so many dangers, threats, and disincentives in connection with reporting that women don't report. So if 51% is what is reported, can you imagine what the actual figure is, right? Layers of violence and discrimination, right? It is bad, you know. So when you look at that, and furthermore, when you look at patriarchy as a patriarchal mindset, how women in Palestine are affected by it. There are two studies here that I'll just read one of the quotes. One is a study of Palestinian women in Palestine. The other is a study of Palestinian women in Israel. But they both come to the same conclusion. I'll just read the one of the Palestinian women in Israel. The one, it says, this study examines the influence of patriarchal ideology on women's beliefs about wife beating. A convenient sample of 701 married Palestinian women from Israel was obtained, and a self-report questionnaire was administered. The findings revealed that large percentages of Palestinian women expressed some tendency to justify wife beating in certain instances. In addition, some of the participants expressed some tendency to blame battered women for violence against them and to believe that they benefit from beating. A hypothesized endorsing patriarchal ideology, as hypothesized, endorsing patriarchal ideology was found to influence all three beliefs about wife beating held by Palestinian women in Israel, over and above the amount of variance in women's socio-demographic characteristics, e.g. age, education, employment, place of residence, and religion, right? So if you wear the lens of the left, the Bernie Sanders camp, what you're going to emphasize is, as we've said, the crimes of colonialism. Israel is a product, the modern state of Israel is a product of colonialism, right? And, but if you view it through a radical feminist lens, and prophetically speaking, remembering that gender is the final test. Why is it that for the far left, Western societies are the ones to be condemned? Western societies bear the brunt of the left's criticism, while they defend, like in this instance, in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, they defend those who are doing far worse in this final prophetic test. So when you wear a radical feminist lens and you view issues going on in the world, you're going to come to different analyses, right? Your analysis will bring to the front, will raise to the surface and elevate, how gender is playing out in relation to that issue. When you look at the left's analysis, not just the Israel-Palestine conflict, but on across a range of issues, the element of gender is absent. It is absent or relegated to a secondary issue, or an issue that they relegate to cultural relativity, that different cultures must be left to live how they choose to on this issue. We're going to respect all cultures. So if that culture is how they do it, then the main issue is the West and the wrong things that the West is doing around the world. Right? But if gender is the final test, then the left is not even preaching. I hope you see that. If gender is the final test, the far left are not even preaching. Their prism, their lens has little space for the issue that God is telling us to put front and center, right? And make the focus of our analyses and what we see, what we rank order as we analyze events in the world, right? What's a recent example? We have the left-leaning media. There's that story that was in the papers, I think last week, or not the week before last week, of how 31 members of, in the United States, 31 members of Patriot Front. Patriot Front is a hate group. 31 members of Patriot Front were arrested at a Pride event. And when you look at how that was reported, the BBC said, US white supremacists arrested at Idaho gay pride event. The CBC said, leader of white supremacist group among those arrested near Idaho pride event. What emphasis, what is their lens emphasizing? I've been talking all this time. What is their lens emphasizing? Right?
White supremacy.
White supremacy, even on an issue when it's a gay pride event, even on an issue where gender should be the focus, even when an issue when, gender really is the focus, the lens that through which they analyze it, they bring it back to race. Do you see that? Which is why learning how to sift the left, an important element of it is being proactive about looking at the news, looking at what you're reading, and scrutinizing it through a radical feminist lens. So even here, BBC, CBC, those are media sources on the right, in the right stream. But we see that they failed. They failed on that issue to rightly present the issue as it relates to the final test for the world.
Elder Tabo, the left is very big on doing nothing, even when they have the power. They don't really bring things to pass. They don't really produce results. And in a sense, by focusing on race, keeping it narrowed in and limited to that, it means they don't have to do anything about gender, which is the real issue, and as we know, the test for the world in this last, in the last dispensation. So in a sense, they still continue along a path of do nothingness, but they'll justify it by focusing on something that, Black Lives Matter. They saw the whole movement that swept across the world, in a sense, after George Floyd's murder. But as Elder Tess has put it, we have got to see beyond that. Doesn't mean that race isn't still important, because racism never was eradicated. But at the same time, it moved on to sexism and gender equality. And the left is not wanting to end up on the right side of that issue, of that conflict. Anyway, just a thought I had.
Yes, no, thank you for that thought. It's all correct, right? I agree with what you've shared. And if anyone else has any thoughts, please feel free to stop me and share. So I hope we see that, because it's not something that even in this movement, even though we've been talking about radical feminism for a long time now, we're still failing to center gender in our analyses. We're still failing to see the magnitude of the problem by and large. And part of the failure has been we've relied on the left, right? Because at one point it was sufficient to just say left and right, two streams, left and right. And it was a struggle for many people. Many people left. But many people then, saw light and said, all right, the left is the correct stream. But it's not enough anymore to say the left is in the correct stream. Now the messages requires greater clarity than in former years, right? Which require us to be able to sift the left, to divide between truth and error on the left, because there is a lot of dangerous error. Right, and one of them is just this key issue that we are, the left's analysis in media, in politics, in academia, relegates gender to a secondary issue, or an issue that is if not said outrightly, it's communicated in their handling of it and how they emphasize it, relegated to being governed by cultural relativism. And people have been listening to these drinking indiscriminately from these sources for years. And as a result, we come to 2022 and many of the priests are still unprepared to give the message, right? There's a work that needs to be done in terms of correcting the worldview and the perspective that is shared, and learning how to sift the left. So now I'll just make a few points as we draw to a close. Colonialism and racism, they have been and they are serious issues facing society. But they are not issues limited to color or Western society, right? Racism and colonialism, imperialism is not limited to Western society. I can think of pre-colonial Southern Africa. A lot of imperial conquest happened between various tribes and nations before Europeans came and settled, or even in the early period of European settlement before they had dominated, right? The same goes, many examples in the near and far east of imperialistic behavior, right? Or even behavior that would classify as racism. It's not a phenomena that is peculiar to the West. So that's an important point. And colonialism and racism are also not the cause of sexism within society. Colonialism did not introduce misogyny or gender stereotypes. Right? This is another left-wing argument that where the left is guilty of reinventing history, as much as the right is accused of that, the left is guilty on this point as well. That in their criticism of the West, cultures from the global South are praised, held in high regard, and virtues are imputed to them that they don't really have, and it's identified that the West brought misogyny. I've read that. I'm reading that, university studies, that the West introduced misogyny to a lot of these cultures, and now we see the devastating effect misogyny is having on this culture. That's not true, right? That's not true. The West did not introduce misogyny or gender stereotypes. Those have existed as long as those have existed since the fall. Right? And nothing is colonialism and racism versus sexism. They should not be on an equal footing today. It is not a 50-50 issue. They are not equal tests because they are not equal issues in society. Whether we say domestically or internationally, they are not equal issues in society. The test is not racism, it is sexism. And we don't see that they are not equal issues in society because we are not sensitive to sexism. We're not as sensitive to sexism as we are to race. And this is a function of our education and our cultural conditioning, which has sensitized us to issues of race beyond that of gender. And sexism is so deeply rooted. Again, if you're a radical feminist, sexism is the oldest and deeply rooted and most pervasive form of oppression known to humanity. Sexism is so deeply rooted, we are blind to its severity within society. Right? We're imperceptive we're blind to it, whether it's, at the national or political level, within the various ways it is formed within the workplace, the various manifestations of it in the home or in relationships, right? Where we are blind to its severity within society and the way it manifests itself in our society, in our relationships, and in our lives. And this is what this message is trying to undo, right? We need to become more sensitive to the extent and pervasiveness, the ugliness and the seriousness of sexism. For me, it was a revelation how bad the issue of gender-based violence is in say, Palestine. But when you start to view things through a radical feminist lens, you will analyze things differently. So colonialism and race, yes?
Sorry, Thibault, not to interrupt.
Okay.
No, just as you were saying that, I was thinking, in many ways, the developing countries, or the countries that, not to comment on Eurocentrism, but let's label it America centrism, Canada, the US, countries that are distant to us and with a different culture and etc. Over time, over decades and decades, it's been very easy for us to, particularly prior to social media, the internet, and certainly in more recent time, the development of social media that has everything in real time and instant, it's been easy to ignore where people can perhaps feel, well, that's those countries' culture, and they are very, even using words like patriarchal or whatever. But though perhaps a little more subtle, what sexism and misogyny has been festering under the surface within the Americas, America, and even in Europe, the Western countries, has also been coming to light just because of all of the various court cases and the Me Too, all of these steps, these developments have laid bare that it is worldwide. It is a worldwide phenomenon, whether it be a China, Yemen, Myanmar, Afghanistan, United States, whatever country, it is a worldwide phenomenon. And for the left or us in the movement to slight it, to ignore it, to relegate sexism and gender equality to a subset of racism or just Western imperialism or whatever, is, as you put it, in a sense, rewriting history, and for our purposes, even the prophetic unfolding of what the test is for today at the end. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on the subtlety. Externally, it's in society, in Canada and the US, that people downplay, like they'll ignore LGBTQ or women's rights, reproductive rights, all the rights, and zero in again on race. But it's almost like it's something that people don't really want to have to deal with, so they default to racism, because that's something they can assure themselves, I'm not racist, and continue on the same old, as opposed to, as you said, for us in the movement, but even for the world, across the world, God is wanting a different lens being applied to help us see wherein how deeply it has been ingrained in all of us, and to be able to cooperate with him at rooting it out. Anyway, thank you to both. Sorry, it was long.
Amen. No, thanks for that, Debbie. Okay, so just some thoughts as we close. We have a few minutes left. So colonialism and racism were never meant to be the central focus of the priests. And if they're not the central focus of the priests, they're not meant to be the central focus of the Levites or the Nethinim either. They were a means to an end, right? Our handling of the issue of racism and colonialism, it was meant to help us understand sexism, right? Right, by understanding what systemic oppression on the basis of immutable features looks like. The lessons you learn there, you can transfer to your analysis and your consideration of sexism. Right? It was meant to help us better understand sexism. But instead, many in the movement have made it a means to an end. They've made it the end in and of itself. And that is a failure in light of what the final test is. So to take it back to our alpha history, and because this is another very useful tool, right? We talk about how to sift and how to view things. We've spoken about being intentional in analyzing issues with a radical feminist perspective, with an eye towards shaking up to the surface the issue of sexism and how it plays out on that particular subject you're looking at. That's important. It requires intentionality. But another very useful tool is comparing an issue with racism, right? Like, for example, if I had an example, I think that I was actually discussing with Sakai. My illustration has left my mind, but it's useful to substitute race for gender in an issue that you're trying to consider. And time again, you'll find that something that may not look so bad when it's discussed in the context of gender, when you substitute race, you're like, that's unacceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable. So if it's not acceptable for race, why is it acceptable for gender? Right? And that becomes a way of identifying one's own blind spots. Right? There are things that if you said them within the context where you put race in it, it wouldn't be acceptable. But if we take out race and put gender, and the same thing was said or done, people don't feel so bad about it. Right? That's evidence of our desensitization to the seriousness of sexism. So this illustration that I want to give, if you look at if you take how the left wing's global handling of gender equality, how they're handling gender equality now, and take it to our alpha history and substitute gender for race, right? It's as if, in light of slavery, the abolitionists, the people who are championing the testing issue, right? the abolitionists, imagine the abolitionists relegating racism to a relatively minor priority. And then they hold some sympathy with the South, saying we have to respect their culture. Surely some things are culturally relative. It would be imperialistic for another state to condemn Texas and to try to change their culture. So then after relegating slavery as the central issue, they then direct all their energies to condemning Britain for its failures, right? When you put it within that context, you start to see the magnitude of the left's failure in this dispensation. If those people who are meant to be abolitionists in Millerite history, if they acted as the left has done today, that would have been a history of success for the South. 1850 would have been a true Sunday law, and Christ would have returned. And that becomes very, very important food for thought when we look at the landscape today in terms of how the left is handling the testing issue. We cannot safely just take it in. We have to learn to sift the left, and we have to be more intentional about our radical feminist lens in how we view the world and analyze issues. So that's the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions, or contributions before I close with prayer?
It's a little like a blame game as well. We take any blame off ourselves by pointing the finger outward and blaming something else. So the left and the far left focusing on imperialism, and these atheists that want to really focus on the West and how rotten it is and all of the oppression, never mind oppression that's going on other places in the world. We'll ignore that. That's secondary. It's being able to lay blame in a targeted way. And as I say, you can justify yourself, feel better about yourself, and that you're on the side of right and you're doing battle and you've got a cause, but while at the same time really missing the real cause and making it invisible, which is part of the problem. Women have been invisible for a long time, very long time, and LGBTQ. It's only been in recent time, really, where there was some safety extended to them so they could live more normally, but that's possibly going to disappear as well. So that blame that comes right back to sin and Adam and Eve in Eden and the human heart, the natural carnal heart tending to want to blame rather than to look inward and see where I need to change. Excellent study, Tabo. Thank you.
No, praise God. Anyone else to comment before I close? Okay, thank you for your time, everyone. Let's close the word of prayer. Lord in heaven, we come to your feet, thanking you for this big Sabbath that has come to a close. We thank you for the light that you are now sending to us. Help us to take it in. Help us to to view the world through a radical feminist lens, and to do the deep work of untangling ourselves from the problematic aspects of the left's worldview, the aspects, Lord, which, unless we overcome them, just as surely as right-wing thinking would cause us to lose our way and be lost. Please, please bless us in the new week until we meet again, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.